The ritual knife was already at her throat when Sera realized no one in the chamber was going to stop it. She had felt the blade before she saw it, a cold press against the side of her neck, just below the jaw, where the pulse ran closest to the skin. Elder Caius held it steady. His hand did not shake. That was what she would remember later, when she had the luxury of remembering. Not the fear, not the torchlight slicking gold across the stone walls of the council chamber, but the absolute stillness of an old man's hand as he prepared to mark her in a way she had not agreed to. 47 people stood in that chamber. She had counted them once, a long time ago at her first ceremonial summons, the way a child counts things to stay calm. 47 representatives of the 12 packs of the Ashvale territory, plus the 5 council elders who governed them all under the authority of Alpha King Raiden Vale. 47 people who had known her name since she was born. Not one of them moved. Sera Voss, Elder Caius said, and his voice carried the particular resonance of a man who had practiced words until they stopped meaning anything. You are called before this council, under the right of binding correction. Do you understand the charge? She understood nothing. That was the truth she pressed down beneath the stillness she was trying to hold in her own body, the steadiness she was borrowing from some part of herself she hadn't known existed until the moment cold metal touched her skin. She was 31 years old. She was the pack's appointed record keeper, a title that had seemed boring and safe until tonight. She had not, to her knowledge, done anything that warranted a blade. I have not been told the charge, she said. Her voice came out level. Caius smiled. It did not reach his eyes. That, he said, is the point. She had been brought here from the archive room. She had been working late, as she often did, because the archive was the one place in the Ashvale Pack compound where silence felt like a gift rather than a punishment. She sorted records. She catalogued. She was good at it, not because anyone had trained her well, but because she had the kind of mind that noticed when things were missing. When dates didn't align, when a record was stamped and sealed and filed in a way that suggested enormous care had been taken to make sure no one ever looked at it too closely. That was what had happened 3 weeks ago. She had found a file. Or more precisely, she had found the space where a file should have been, and then she had found the file itself hidden inside a secondary binding of a census record from 52 years ago, folded twice and pressed flat and overlooked by whoever had hidden it there, because that person had probably assumed no one would ever unseal a census record to check its physical construction. Sera had unsealed it, not because she suspected anything, because the spine had felt wrong. She had not told anyone what she found. She had been trying to understand it first. That caution, it turned out, had not saved her. The chamber had gone quiet in the way that places go quiet when everyone in them is waiting for someone else to react first. Torches lined the walls at intervals, and the smoke from them hung in the upper air in pale ribbons. She could smell pine resin and old stone and something sharper, a chemical smell she associated with the formal inks used for council documents. Her mouth tasted like copper, though the blade had not yet broken the skin. You have been accessing restricted archival materials, Caius said, without the authorization of this council. I am the record keeper, Sera said. I have access to the full archive. That is the role. The role, said a second voice, and she moved her eyes carefully without moving her head, to find Elder Davin speaking from his position at the curved stone bench that formed the council's formal seating. He was younger than Caius by perhaps a decade, heavier, with the look of a man who had once been physically impressive and now carried the remnant of it in his posture. The role extends to active records, not to sealed materials held under council authority. I was not aware those materials were sealed. You were not aware, Caius repeated, and there was something in the repetition that told her this had been rehearsed. And yet you removed the material from its location. She had not removed anything. She had read it once, sitting on the cold floor of the archive with her back against the shelving. And then she had placed it exactly where she had found it, tucked back inside the census binding, and she had spent 3 weeks thinking about what it meant before coming to any conclusions. She had told no one. She had written nothing down, and they still knew, which meant someone had been watching her, which meant someone had been in that archive, or watching the archive, for a reason that predated her discovery. They had been waiting for her to find it, or they had been watching to make sure. No one did, and she had been the person who looked at the wrong spine at the wrong moment, and now she was standing in the council chamber with a blade against her throat, and 47 people, arranged in the specific geometry of witnesses rather than rescuers. The right of binding correction, she said. The words came out of some part of her that had been reading archival documents long enough to know the phrase. even if she had never expected to hear it applied to herself. That right requires the consent of the subject. The silence that followed was different from the previous silence. It had texture. "You are well read," Caius said. "I'm the record keeper," she said. "I've read everything," and that, she understood as she said it, was the problem. That had always been the problem. She had read everything, and they had let her, because they believed certain things were buried well enough that a careful, quiet woman with ink-stained fingers and no political ambitions would never find them. They had miscalculated, or she had miscalculated. It was becoming difficult to tell the difference. Elder Caius removed the blade from her throat. She did not allow herself to exhale visibly. "You will submit to the right," he said, "or you will be charged with the violation of sealed council records and removed from your position. The pack will be told the reason." He paused. "Your family is here, Sera. Your mother has been a seamstress for the council for 23 years. It would be a shame." There it was. The shape of it, clear now, the way the shape of a building becomes clear once the scaffolding comes down. They were not going to kill her. They were going to mark her. They were going to use the right of binding correction to do what that right did, which was to bind a subject's testimony, to prevent them, through a supernatural mechanism older than the council itself, from speaking certain things aloud. A gag made of old law rather than cloth. A silencing written on the body. She understood, in the moment she understood this, that the document she had found must be significant beyond what she had already guessed. She had read it once, in the cold archive on a Thursday night. She had not memorized it word for word, but she had a good memory, and the key phrases had lodged. Ancient law. Right of contested succession. The provision that stated that in cases where an alpha king had taken power through means other than the ordained succession right, a challenge could be issued by any pack member who held documented evidence of the violation. Any pack member, not a rival alpha, not an elder, any member. The provision had been invoked once, in the founding generation, and had resulted in the removal of an alpha king who had seized power by poison rather than trial. The council that followed him had buried the provision so completely that Sera had found it only by accident, pressed flat inside a census binding, overlooked for 52 years. And now she was standing in the chamber with the evidence of its burial fresh in her lungs. And Elder Caius was offering her the choice between consent and coercion, and 47 people watched with the careful blankness of those who have already decided where their loyalties lie. She looked at Caius, she looked at Devon. She looked, finally, at the man she had not let herself look at directly since she entered the chamber. Because she had believed, until this moment, that looking at him would be the thing that broke her composure entirely. Alpha King Raiden Vale stood at the back of the chamber, not at the council bench, not at the formal position of judgment. He stood against the far wall with his arms at his sides, and his face composed into something that was not quite neutral, a careful holding, the expression of a man who was watching a situation he had either caused or allowed, and was not certain yet which version of that truth he preferred. She had known Raiden Vale for 11 years. She had worked in his pack's archive for 8 of them. She had, for approximately 4 of those years and never once allowed, loved him with the specific misery of someone who knows the feeling is too large for the container of the life they're allowed to live. She looked at him now. His jaw tightened. He did not speak. Sera turned back to Elder Caius. "I consent," she said. She did not mean it. She meant something else entirely. But consent was what they needed to make the right legal. And legal was important, because the document she had read said something very specific about what happened to bindings applied through improper ritual process, and she needed the process to be on record, and she needed to be conscious and present and intact for what she intended to do next. The right required 3 components. She had read that too in a different record years ago, filed under liturgical history without any apparent sense of irony. First, the verbal acknowledgement of the charge. Second, the ritual mark, applied to the inner wrist with the consecrated blade and the binding ink. Third, the witness seal, spoken aloud by the presiding elder and confirmed by at least 12 additional voices. Caius read the charge. She acknowledged it. He pressed the blade, newly inked, against the inside of her left wrist, and the pain was a hot, bright line that she received with a stillness she found somewhere below conscious thought, because that was what the moment required. The mark settled into her skin. She felt it, not just the physical sting, but the other thing, the supernatural weight of it, a pressure that moved up her arm and spread across her chest like a hand pressing inward. She had never felt anything like it. Most pack members never encountered old ritual directly enough to feel it work. She felt it now, and it was not nothing. It was real and it was old, and it settled into her like a key turning. The 12 voices came. Caius spoke the witness seal. The chamber exhaled. Sera kept her breathing even and her eyes forward. The mark on her wrist pulsed once and went still. Her left hand tingled from the wrist to the fingertips, and she curled her fingers slowly, testing, and looked down at the mark and thought, "They don't know what I know. They think they've sealed what matters. They have no idea what I found in the archive. Not really, because if they did, they would not have left me conscious, and they would not have left the record intact. She would not be able to speak certain things aloud. That was what the right did. But the right said nothing about writing, and she had, at home in her apartment 2 floors above the archive, behind the loose backing panel of the kitchen drawer, a piece of paper she had written before she ever came to the council chamber tonight, when she had begun to suspect something was wrong, and had the strange, cold instinct to prepare. A transcription, from memory, every key phrase from the document in the census binding. She looked once more at Raiden Vale as Caius dismissed her. He was still watching her. The careful holding in his face had shifted to something she could not name, something that moved through his eyes and was gone before she could catalogue it. She did not wait to see if he would speak. She turned and walked out of the council chamber through the stone corridor, and out into the cold night air. She breathed in pine and frost and the wide, impersonal darkness of the Ashville forest, and she began, very carefully, to think. She knew 3 things with certainty. First, the document existed, and it proved that Alpha King Raiden Vale had taken his throne not through the ordained succession rite, but through a process that the council had retroactively declared equivalent, a declaration that the foundational provision specifically, explicitly, categorically rejected as insufficient. Second, the council had known for 52 years and had buried the provision to protect the current dynasty's lineage, which meant the corruption was not recent but structural, woven into the body of the Pact's governance so completely that the people upholding it probably no longer thought of it as corruption. Third, Raiden Vale had stood in that chamber and watched them put a ritual blade against her wrist and said nothing. 3 things. She let herself feel the third one for exactly the length of time it took her to walk from the chamber entrance to the edge of the forest path. Then she pressed it down, because feeling it was a luxury she could not afford yet. Later. She would feel it later. For now, there was work to do. She lived in the residential section of the compound, a 2-story building divided into small apartments allocated to senior staff. Her apartment was on the upper floor, second door from the stairs, and she had lived there for 6 years and known it well enough to navigate it without light if she needed to. She needed to now. She took the stairs quietly and let herself in without turning on any lamps, because the windows faced the courtyard, and she did not want to announce that she was doing anything other than going to bed after a traumatic evening. The mark on her wrist continued its low, persistent pulse. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and pressed her right thumb against it, feeling the raised edge of it, and thought about what it could and could not do. She had read the rite's mechanism once, in a liturgical commentary filed without any particular urgency in the devotional practices section of the archive. The binding correction sealed the subject's voice on specific matters. It worked, as all old ritual worked, through specificity. It bound the words most directly related to the charges spoken, the verbal form most likely to constitute the violation. In her case, that meant she could not speak aloud about the document. She could not name its contents in direct speech to any person who might act on the information. But the commentary had included a footnote that she suspected Elder Caius had not read, because it was a footnote in a liturgical commentary filed in the devotional practices section of the archive, and Elder Caius was the kind of man who had stopped reading footnotes when he stopped needing to. The footnote said, "The binding correction was originally designed to prevent false testimony in judicial proceedings, not to suppress evidence in matters of contested succession, and in the specific case of the latter, its application was considered a violation of the ancient law it was meant to uphold." In other words, using the binding correction to silence someone who had discovered a contested succession claim was not just morally dubious. It was, under the precise letter of the foundational law, a self-defeating act. The rite's own architecture rejected its misapplication, and a binding correction, improperly applied to suppress a legitimate contested succession challenge, could be dissolved by the submission of written evidence to a neutral authority outside the council's jurisdiction. She had at home written evidence. What she needed was the neutral authority. She found the paper in the kitchen drawer where she had left it, unfolded it on the table in the dark, and ran her fingers across the surface, feeling the indentations of her own handwriting. She did not read it. She did not need to. She had written it, and she remembered what it said. She folded it twice, tightly, and held it in her right hand, and thought about where you went when the authority you lived under was the authority you were challenging. There were three entities in the broader supernatural governance structure of the Ashvale region that existed outside the Alpha King's direct jurisdiction. The Interpack Tribunal, which had not convened in 30 years and required a majority of pack representatives to summon, which meant the people she was challenging would control whether it convened. The Territorial Spirit Court, which was largely ceremonial and whose last meaningful action had been a boundary dispute in the previous century. And the Order of the Ashvale Compact, a body of neutral arbiters established by the original founding law, the same founding law that contained the provision she had found, tasked specifically with protecting the integrity of the succession right. She had read about the order in the archive. She had read about them the way you read about things that are old and probably defunct, with academic interest rather than practical expectation. But she had also, because she was the kind of person who kept thorough records, noted their last documented meeting place, which was a structure called the Compact Hall, located in the northern edge of the forest, approximately 4 miles from the compound. No one had filed an official communication with the Order of the Ashvale Compact in 50 years. She was beginning to understand why. She put the paper in the inside pocket of her coat. She found her boots by the door and laced them with steady hands. The wrist mark pulsed against the leather of her coat sleeve, and she felt the constraint of it. The specific unpleasant sensation of a thing pressing against a threshold it had constructed, and she thought about what it meant that she could feel it, really feel it, in a way she had not expected to be able to. Most modern pack members, had very little contact with old ritual. The supernatural structures that governed them operated largely in the background of their lives, like the structural foundations of a building, essential, invisible, noticed only when something went wrong. Sera had spent 8 years reading the records of those structures, and she had developed, through that proximity, a kind of sensitivity that she had never named and never discussed, because it had seemed too unusual to be useful. She could feel the mark. She could feel its edges, its internal logic, the specific shape of what it was preventing. And in feeling it, she could also feel, the way you feel a draft that tells you where a window is, the shape of what it was trying to prevent. It wanted her silent. It was working, in its old mechanism, with the integrity of a thing that believed in itself. And precisely because it was working with integrity, it was showing her its architecture. It could not touch the paper. She was certain of it in the way she was certain of well-documented facts. The binding was applied to her voice, to her spoken testimony. The paper was prior to the binding. It was outside the ritual's reach. She had one more thing to do before she left. She went to the small desk in the corner of the apartment where she kept her personal correspondence materials and wrote, by memory, in the dark, because she had good enough hands and a good enough mind to write in the dark if she needed to. A second copy of the transcription. She dated it, she signed it with her full name and her title. Sera Foss, appointed record keeper, Ashvale Pack, served under the authority of Alpha King Radon Vale. She folded it and addressed it in a hand she trusted, which was her own, and she left it in the envelope on the desk, with the internal address of the one person in the compound she believed was not implicated. The healer Marin. She had known Marin for 6 years. Marin kept her own counsel and had never, in any interaction Sera could recall, indicated that she believed the council's authority was equivalent to the pack's good. If Sera did not return, Marin would find the envelope and, being Marin, would eventually do something useful with it. Then she went out through the side door of the residential building, through the compound wall at the section where the maintenance gate was left unlatched for the night staff, and into the forest, heading north. The night was cold, in the way late autumn was cold, with a damp that reached through layers, and the forest was dark in the way that felt organic rather than oppressive. The darkness of a living thing at rest rather than a thing withholding light. She had grown up at the edge of this forest. She knew the sound of it, the particular acoustic texture of the Ashvale pines at night, the way sound traveled differently when the canopy was dense. She moved through it by hearing as much as by sight, following the path that the archive records described as the Northern Maintenance Road, now largely reclaimed by undergrowth, but still visible, if you knew what the original cartographers had marked as landmarks. She had read the map, she had a good memory, she walked. The mark on her wrist pulsed steadily, and she let it, because it was not slowing her down, and she was not going to give it the dignity of her attention. She thought instead about what she knew, and what she didn't know, and what she needed. She knew the provision existed. She had the transcription. She knew the order of the Asheville Compact had the authority, under the foundational law, to receive and evaluate a challenge to a succession. She knew that the binding correction applied to her tonight was itself a violation of that same foundational law. She knew that the council had buried the provision 52 years ago, which meant the current dynasty, Raiden's dynasty, his father's dynasty, the line that had ruled since before she was born, rested on a foundation that the founding law rejected. She did not know if the order still existed as a functioning body. She did not know if anyone would be at Compact Hall. She did not know what happened after a succession challenge was filed, in a world that had not seen one in living memory. She did not know what Raiden had known, or when he had known it, or whether the careful holding in his face when he watched Caius press a ritual blade to her wrist had been complicity or something else. She had thought, for 4 years, that she knew him, that the version of him she saw in the archive and in the corridor, and in the brief, specific moments when their professional lives intersected, was the real version. She had constructed, in her private interior life, an elaborate and detailed portrait of a man who was trying to be better than the institution he led. That portrait was getting harder to maintain. She walked for an hour through the dark forest before she saw the first marker, a stone pillar set at the edge of the path, with a symbol carved into it that matched the description in the archive record she had read 5 years ago on a slow afternoon, with no particular agenda. The symbol was a circle bisected by a vertical line, the old compact mark, worn by weather but unmistakably present. She pressed her fingers against it as she passed and felt, to her surprise, a faint warmth in the stone, and did not know what that meant but noted it. The compact hall appeared 15 minutes later, and her first response to it was relief, because it existed, which she had begun to doubt, and her second response was something more complicated. It was smaller than she had imagined from the records, a single-story stone structure, with a broad roof and no windows on the side facing her, with a large door of weathered wood that stood slightly ajar. Light came through the gap, warm and steady, the kind of light that came from a fire rather than electricity. She stopped at the tree line and listened for 2 full minutes, cataloging the sounds, the fire, a small one by its acoustic signature, the occasional movement of something living inside the building, no voices, no alarm. She crossed the open ground and pushed the door open. There was one person inside. She sat at a table near the fire in the center of the room, and she was old in the way certain people are old, deeply and without apology, with white hair braided back from a face that had the particular quality of a thing that has been tested many times and has opinions about it. She wore the compact symbol on a cord at her throat. She was reading something when Sera entered, and she looked up without surprise. "I wondered when one of you would come," the old woman said. Sera stopped 3 steps inside the door. "You've been waiting?" she said. "Waiting implies expectation," the old woman said. "I have been present. There is a difference." She closed the book she had been reading and set it to the side with the deliberateness of someone who respected books. "Come in and sit down. You have been marked, I can see it from here, and you have been walking, and neither of those things is easy to do at the same time." Sera sat in the chair across the table. The fire was warm on her left side, and she allowed herself to feel it, the animal comfort of heat after cold, and she set her right hand flat on the table and looked at the woman. "You are of the order," she said. "I am the order at present," the woman said without particular distress. "My name is Arbitress Isolde. I have been maintaining this hall under the terms of the original compact charter for 31 years. Because the charter requires continuous presence for the order to retain jurisdictional authority, and because no one from the pack or the council has filed anything with us in 50 years, and I intended to be here when that changed." Sera stared at her. "You knew," she said. "I knew that the provision existed and that it had been buried, yes," Isolde said. "What I did not know, and could not act on without knowing, was whether the documentation could be recovered. The charter requires documentary evidence for a succession challenge. Testimony alone is insufficient." She looked at Sera's right hand, which still pressed slightly against the inside of her coat. "I think you have documentation. A transcription," Sera said, "from memory, written prior to the binding correction. I believe it falls outside the right's reach." "The binding correction." Isolde said the words with a particular flatness. "They applied the binding correction to you, tonight, in the council chamber." Isolde was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled. Then she said, very calmly, "The application of a binding correction to suppress evidence relevant to a contested succession challenge is itself a violation of the foundational law. It constitutes an additional act of institutional betrayal. That substantially strengthens any challenge filed." "I know," Sera said. "I read the footnote. Something moved in Isolde's expression, a brief warmth quickly returned to neutral. You are the record keeper. I am the record keeper. Then give me what you have. Sera withdrew the paper from inside her coat and unfolded it on the table between them. She did not speak while Isolde read it, because the mark on her wrist tightened when she tried. The specific pressure of it responding to proximity to the material as though it could tell how close she was to the line. She let it. The paper spoke. She watched Isolde's face as she read, and watched the careful neutrality of it hold, and then settle into something quieter. A recognition that was not surprise but was something adjacent to it. The confirmation of a long-held suspicion that still lands with weight when it finally arrives. This is sufficient, Isolde said. Sufficient to file a challenge. Sufficient to initiate the compact's formal review process, which under the foundational law carries the same authority as a challenge filed with the Interpact Tribunal. Meaning, the Council cannot block it, cannot dismiss it, cannot convene an alternative process to supersede it. The review will proceed regardless of the Alpha King's cooperation. She looked up. You understand what this means for the pack? Sera had thought about this for 3 weeks. She had thought about it while sitting in the archive, reading innocuous records that surrounded the buried one. She had thought about it on the walk here. She had thought about it, if she was honest, for much longer than that, in the vague and unspecified way that you think about a thing you suspect without yet being able to name. It means the succession has to be revisited, she said. The current dynasty's claim has to be adjudicated under the provisions that were supposed to govern it from the beginning. Yes. It means the pack will be destabilized. The pack is already destabilized, Isolde said with a precision that did not feel unkind. A governance structure built on a concealed violation is not stable. It is a weight on a foundation that was never built for it. What you are doing is not creating an instability. You are making visible one that already exists. Sera pressed her right hand against the table. The fire was warm. Her wrist ached. She thought about her mother, who had sewn council vestments for 23 years, without knowing that the body she was dressing had dressed itself in something it had no right to wear. How long does the review take? She said. The charter mandates a 30-day period for the compact to compile evidence, during which time the challenged party must be notified and given the opportunity to respond. If the challenge is upheld after review, the Council has 90 days to convene a proper succession right under the original terms. And if they refuse? The foundational law grants the order the authority to declare the existing succession void, Isolde said, and to appoint a temporary governance structure from among the Pact's neutral members until a proper succession is conducted. The fire shifted again. Somewhere in the dark outside the hall, a night bird called once and went quiet. Sera thought about Raiden Vale, standing against the wall of the council chamber, and his jaw tightening, and his mouth staying closed. She thought about 4 years of accumulated feeling, and what it meant to carry something that carefully, and have it turn out to be a thing she had not understood completely. She had not understood that the man she had built in her private interior was made partly of her own materials. She had selected from what she observed. She had not known what she was leaving out. That was not a comfortable thing to know. She held it anyway. File it, she said. Isolde nodded once. She withdrew a document case from beneath the table, old leather, cracked at the corners but intact, and took from it a form that was printed on heavy paper, and had clearly been waiting in that case for a very long time. She uncapped an ink pen. She dated the form. She wrote Sera's name and title in precise letters, and she noted the evidence type and attached Sera's transcription with 2 small clips from her case. I need your formal statement of submission, she said. It does not have to be verbal given the binding. Sera took the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the form, and under it she wrote, in clear unambiguous letters, I submit this challenge freely and without coercion, in the knowledge that it will be followed wherever the process leads. She meant every word. Isolde countersigned it and pressed the compact seal to the bottom of the page, and the seal was warm when it landed, visibly warm, leaving a mark in the paper that held a faint luminescence for 3 seconds before settling. The fire in the center of the room brightened briefly and returned to its previous level. The challenge has been filed, Isolde said. The review process has begun. The Alpha King and the Council will receive formal notification within 48 hours under the Compact Charter's provisions. They will know who filed it. I know, Sera said. You understand there will be consequences. There already were, Sera said, and lifted her marked wrist slightly. They tried consequences first. This is my answer. She stayed in the compact hall that night, because Usoldi offered, and because walking back through the forest to the compound in the early hours of the morning to sleep in an apartment that the council now knew to be compromised would have been both physically exhausting and tactically foolish. She slept on a cot in the back room, with the fire still burning and the mark on her wrist pulsing in its slow rhythm, and she dreamed, and in the dream she was back, in the archive reading the census binding, and the document unfolded itself without her touching it, and every word was lit from inside with a cold, clear light, and she read it again as though for the first time, and the words were the same words she remembered. She woke before dawn with the particular clarity that comes after a decision has been made and survived. The mark still ached. She moved her wrist and watched the skin move with it, the raised line of it, and she thought about what it had intended to do to her and what it had done instead. They had marked her to contain her. They had used a mechanism designed to silence. And in doing so, in applying a binding correction to a matter of contested succession, they had, under the precise letter of the foundational law, committed an additional violation that was now part of the formal record. They had strengthened her case with their attempt to neutralize her. That was what happened when you used a law's tools against a person who had read the law more carefully than you had. She heard Usolde moving in the main room and went out to find tea already on the table, and she sat and drank it and watched the early light come through the gap in the door. "What happens to the record-keeper position while the review is in process?" she said. "The charter provides that any PAC employee who files a formal challenge is granted protective status for the duration of the review period," Isolde said. "They cannot be terminated, reassigned, or further ritually marked. If the council attempts any of those actions, the violation is added to the formal record and increases the weight of the challenge." Sera held her tea. "They don't know that either." "Almost certainly not," Isolde said. "The charter has not been read by anyone with council standing in 50 years. They buried the provision, but they did not study what surrounded it. They buried it and then they stopped reading. Powerful institutions frequently make that mistake," Isolde said, without inflection. "They believe concealment is equivalent to elimination. They do not account for the possibility that what they buried will be found by someone who reads footnotes." Sera returned to the compound at mid-morning, walking back along the northern path in pale autumn light that came through the pine canopy in long angles and lay across the forest floor in pieces. Her wrist ached less in the cold air than it had the previous night. She walked at a steady pace and thought about what she would find when she got back and what she would do about it, and how much of that she was able to predict. She had expected that the council would know she had been out overnight. She had expected that Elder Caius would summon her, or that there would be a guard at the compound gate, or some other visible sign of the council's awareness that the situation had moved in a direction they had not anticipated. She had not expected that the first person she saw when she came through the maintenance gate was Radon Vale. He was standing in the service corridor just inside the gate, alone, without attendants or advisors, dressed in what she could only describe as the kind of clothes a person wears when they have left the formal context deliberately. He turned when he heard her come through, and his face did something complex that she observed and did not interpret immediately, because she needed more data and she was done filling in the spaces with her own materials. "You were at the compact hall," he said. She stopped a few feet from him. The morning light in the corridor was indirect, soft, and it caught the angles of his face in a way she had always been aware of, and was now carefully not allowing herself to respond to. "Yes," she said. "You filed the challenge." "Yes." He was quiet. She watched his hands, which were at his sides closed slightly, not tightly. He had the look of a man who had been thinking all night, which she recognized because she had been thinking all night herself. "I didn't know," he said, "until the council told me about the file 2 weeks ago. They came to me with what they had found, the access records from the archive, and told me you had discovered the provision. I didn't know the provision had been buried. My father never told me. The council told me when they had to, which was when you found it." She held that. She examined it for internal consistency, for the particular flavors of truth and performance. She had spent 8 years reading documents, and the skill that had developed was not only for text. "And the chamber," she said. Something in his face moved, a brief contraction, like a flinch that had been recalled halfway through. "They told me the right was procedural, that it was standard protocol for archival violations. I trusted that." "You trusted it," she said. "Elder Caius had a blade at my throat, and you trusted his characterization of the procedure. I did not understand the rights mechanism. I know that isn't sufficient." She looked at him for a long moment. The mark on her wrist pulsed, slow and steady, against the sleeve of her coat. My father's succession, he said, and his voice changed on those words, going quieter and more careful, the voice of a man handling something he has only recently been given. My grandfather was the one who conducted it. My father was 22. Whatever happened in that succession, whatever the violation was, he may not have fully understood the mechanism either. I am not saying that exonerates the concealment. I am saying the chain of knowledge is not what the council has been presenting to me. Your grandfather buried the provision, Sera said. Yes, the council has been maintaining that burial for 52 years. Yes, and you have been the beneficiary of a succession that the foundational law would reject. A pause. Yes. She had thought about what she wanted from this conversation, or rather, she had thought about what she did not want. She did not want him to explain his way back into the version she had built of him in the 4 years she had been constructing it. She did not want to feel the pull of it and call it evidence. She had made enough of those mistakes in the privacy of her own careful, thorough mind. The review process has begun, she said. Arbitress Isolde will send formal notification to the council within 48 hours. The process takes 30 days of evidence compilation, and then a determination. If the challenge is upheld, the succession goes to a proper right under the original terms. I know what the process requires, he said. Do you? I read the foundational law last night, he said. For the first time, I had access to the full archive. I chose not to. He stopped. That is also not sufficient. No, she said. It isn't. They stood in the service corridor in the pale morning light, and she felt the particular weight of something that had no clean resolution, and she did not try to give it one. The challenge was filed. The process was in motion. What happened in the next 30 days would be determined by evidence and by a foundational law that had waited 52 years to be read by someone with the authority to act on it. What happened between herself and Ray Dawn Vale in that time, or after it, was a separate question, and one she refused to answer in a service corridor 40 minutes after coming in from the cold. I will cooperate fully with the Compact's review, he said. I will make the archive available. I will not interfere with Arbitress Isolde's process. I know, she said. And she did know, because she had spent 8 years reading documents, and part of what she had read, in all those records, was who he was when no one was performing for him, and that knowledge was still in her even when she resented the way she had gathered it. That won't make the succession valid, and it won't undo the mark on my wrist. He looked at her wrist, or rather at the place under her coat sleeve where the mark was, and she watched something move through him that she classified as guilt and set aside, because guilt was not the same as repair, and she had not spent a cold night in the forest to accept guilt as currency. No, he said, it won't. She moved past him into the corridor and toward the stairs. In the days that followed, the compound lived in the particular suspended quality of a community that knows something is happening, but does not yet know what. Sera went to the archive each morning and did her work, because the work needed doing, and because the protective status granted by the Compact Charter was conditional on her continued presence in her role. And she had read the charter, and she was not going to give the council any procedural ground to stand on. She catalogued records. She cross-referenced dates. She did the work she had always done with the thoroughness she had always brought to it. Elder Caius came to the archive on the 3rd day. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at her working at the long central table, and she looked up at him and waited. You understand what you have done, he said. I understand what you did, she said, and what my predecessors did. And I understand what the foundational law says about it. The pack will suffer instability, he said. There are members who have built their entire lives on the assumption of the current governance structure. You are not the only person with a family here, Sera. She thought about that. She took it seriously, because it deserved to be taken seriously, and because she was the kind of person who did not dismiss inconvenient complications in the service of simple narratives. The instability is not mine to have avoided, she said. I did not create the violation. I found the record of it. Those are different things. And I would invite you to consider what it means that the council's response to having the violation discovered was to perform a silencing ritual on the record keeper in the middle of the night, in a chamber full of witnesses, with a blade. He had nothing to say to that. She could see him looking for it and finding the shelf empty. The Charter's protective provisions are in effect, she said. If the council makes any move against my position or my person during the review period, it becomes part of the formal record. I thought it was worth mentioning, in case no one had read that section. He left. She went back to her work. Isolde arrived at the compound on day 7, with 2 compact witnesses and a formal request for access to the original census binding that had contained the buried document. Sera provided it, having noted and documented its location the morning after the council chamber incident, because she had been thorough, and because she had anticipated this moment with the specific practical foresight that came from reading every record she had ever been given access to. The original document was intact. It was there, still pressed inside the census binding, still folded twice. One of Isolde's witnesses removed it with gloved hands and placed it in a preservation envelope and photographed it in situ before removal. And Sera watched all of this from across the archive and felt something settle in her chest that was not satisfaction exactly, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a weight that has been precisely accounted for and is now being properly allocated. The council attempted, on day 12, to convene an emergency session to discuss the charter's applicability to the current situation. Radon refused to authorize it. Sera did not know this until she heard it secondhand from Marin the healer, who had received and read the envelope Sera had left on her desk and had, in Marin's characteristic fashion, subsequently become extremely well-informed about everything relevant. They had dinner in Marin's apartment on day 13, and Marin told her what she had heard, and Sera ate soup and thought about what it meant. He shut down the emergency session, Marin said. Caius was furious, apparently. There was a meeting in the East Wing that went on for 3 hours. What did Radon say to Caius? Marin looked at her steadily. According to the staff member, who was unfortunate enough to be in the corridor, he said that the compact's process was proceeding under the authority of a law that superseded council discretion, and that any attempt to interfere with it would itself constitute a violation of that law, which would have consequences for the entire governance structure. Sera looked at her soup. He read the charter, she said. He apparently read quite a lot in a short period of time, Marin said neutrally. Sera did not ask anything else about Radon that night. She ate her soup and listened to Marin talk about other things, and she was grateful for Marin and for soup and for the ordinariness of a dinner table. On day 19, the mark on her wrist changed. She was alone in the archive when it happened, late in the afternoon, working through a box of correspondence records from the period just before the buried provision had been concealed, looking for any additional documents that might be relevant to the review. The mark, which had maintained its slow pulse for nearly 3 weeks, shifted its rhythm. Not more painful, but different. A new quality to it, as though it had encountered something it had not anticipated. She pressed her thumb against it and felt the altered texture and set down the correspondence record and thought. She had been thinking about the mark's mechanism since the night it was applied. The liturgical commentary she had read years ago had been thorough on the rite's construction, but briefer on its dissolution, and she had not fully followed that thread at the time. She followed it now, in her mind, with the focus that came from having the practical stakes of the question very concretely in front of her. The mark's architecture, as she understood it. It operated through the principle of perpetuation, meaning it drew on a sustained source of authority to maintain its function. The source in this case was the council's collective agreement, the 12 voices that had spoken the witness seal. If the authority behind those 12 voices was undermined, if the council itself was found to be operating outside its legitimate bounds, then the mark had no perpetuating source. She thought about the compact's review process and what day 19 of 30 meant in terms of the review's trajectory. She thought about the original document sitting in its preservation envelope at Compact Hall. She thought about what it would mean for the council's authority if the challenge was upheld. And she thought, then, about the document she had found 3 weeks ago, and the specific language of the provision, and what it said about the rights of the person who brought the challenge forward. She had not thought carefully about that part. She had focused on the mechanism of the challenge itself, the succession review, the process. She had not paid attention to the clause that followed the procedural language, the clause that addressed the status of the challenger. She went to Compact Hall the next morning, on day 20, and asked Isolde to read the relevant clause to her, because the binding correction still held, and she needed to hear it in a neutral voice to be certain she was not constructing something from her own materials again. Isolde found the clause in the original document, now formally catalogued in the review file, and read it aloud. The person who brings forth evidence of a violated succession under this provision is recognized by this law as a compact witness. The status of compact witness grants permanent standing in any future succession proceeding, the right to examine all governance documents without restriction, and the protection of the compact's full authority for the duration of the witness's life. No ritual mark applied. to prevent or suppress the witness's testimony shall hold beyond the determination of the review. All such marks are dissolved upon the review's completion by the authority of this law. Sera stood very still in Compact Hall. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, as though acknowledging the words, and she pressed her thumb against it and felt the faint texture of something beginning to shift. "You knew this was here," she said. "I knew the provision existed and that a compact witness had protections," Isolde said. "I did not know the specific language regarding ritual marks until I read the original document last week. I have been thinking about it since." "The mark dissolves," Sera said. "When the review is completed, if the challenge is upheld," Isolde said. "Which is the determination we are still reaching. But yes," she looked at Sera over the document. "They marked you to silence a compact witness. The law will respond to that." Sera went back to the compound in the archive, and she continued her work, and she did not speak about any of this to anyone. She let the days pass, as days pass when you are waiting for something that is already in motion. With a steady, measured attention of someone who has done what they can do, and is now allowing the mechanism to complete itself. On day 29, Ray Dawn came to the archive. He came in the early evening when the light through the high windows was going amber, and the archive had the particular warm quality of the end of a day when good work has been done. He did not come with announcement or formality. He came the way he had always come when he came to the archive for his own reading, which he had done periodically over the 8 years she had known him, with the particular quietness of someone who felt differently inside this room than in any other part of the compound. She was at the central table. She looked up when he came in. He sat in the chair across from her, not at the formal consultation desk, but at the working table, the one she used, with the boxes of correspondence and the cataloging notes spread between them. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. She let him be quiet because she had stopped filling silences for his comfort. "The review will uphold the challenge," he said. "Isolde communicated as much to me this afternoon so that I could prepare. The succession will need to be reconvened under the original terms within 90 days. I know, the council will resist. Caius will resist," she said. "Not all of them. I've been reading the correspondence from the period of the original concealment. 3 of the 12 current pack representatives come from families whose representatives at the time protested the burial of the provision. They have institutional memory of this. They have been waiting, the way Isolde has been waiting, for someone to—" He looked at her. "You've been building the support structure. I've been doing my job," she said. "The job is to know what the records say, Sera." She lets the word sit. "I am asking you," he said carefully, "what you need from me. Not what the process requires, not what the compact charter specifies. What you need, as a separate thing." She thought about this for a longer time than she had thought she would need to. "I need the succession to be reconvened under the original terms," she said. "I need the council to be restructured, to remove the members who participated in the original concealment, or in what happened to me in the chamber. I need my position as record keeper to become a permanent appointment under the compact's authority, rather than the council's, so that what I found cannot be buried again by whoever comes after. I need the mark removed, which will happen when the review completes tomorrow, whether or not we have this conversation." She paused. "And I need you to understand that what you do in the next 90 days, how you conduct yourself in the process, whether you cooperate with the compact's requirements, or attempt to protect your position at the expense of the law, that will determine what I think of you. Not what I thought before, what I think after." Something in his face was very still. "And what happens after that," he said. "That," she said, "depends on what you do." She meant it as clearly as she had meant anything. She was not offering forgiveness or withholding it. She was offering the possibility of a different accounting, one that had not yet been written, one that would be written by what he chose and how he chose it, and whether the man she had spent 4 years constructing in the space of her private interior had any basis in what was actually there. She was not going to tell him that. She was not in the habit of offering her interior life as reassurance. He nodded once, and she recognized in that nod the specific quality of a person taking something seriously, and she noted it the way she noted everything, and filed it under evidence in progress, and went back to her work. On day 30, Arbitress Isolde convened the compact's formal determination in the compound's main hall, which had not been used for anything outside council ceremony in Sera's living memory. She stood at the front of the hall beside Isolde, and Ray Dawn stood across from her, and the hall was full, not just the council but pack members from across the compound. People who had heard that something significant was happening and had come because it was their pack, and they had a right to be present for things that changed it. Elder Caius stood at the council bench with the careful composure of a man who has already decided on a particular version of himself and intends to hold it. Elder Davin stood beside him with slightly less composure. Isolde read the determination. It was long and precise, and it cited the foundational law 17 times, and the buried provision 8 times, and the additional violation of the binding correction application 3 times. And it upheld the challenge in full. The hall was very quiet, then it was not quiet. Caius spoke. Several people spoke. Radon stood where he had been standing, and let the noise happen around him without joining it. And when it reached its peak, he raised his hand once. Not sharply, but with the particular weight of someone who has decided on a thing and intends to be heard. The determination stands, he said. The compact's authority is recognized. The succession right will be reconvened within the Charter's specified 90 days, under the original terms, with the arbitress overseeing the process. The council members who participated in the original concealment of the provision and in the unlawful application of the binding correction to the record keeper will be removed from their positions pending the review of their conduct. He did not look at Caius when he said this. He looked at the hall, at the pack members standing in it, at the people whose entire governance and structure had just been told that it had been running on a buried violation for 52 years and would now have to reckon with that. He looked briefly at Sera. She held his gaze and then she looked at her wrist. The mark was gone. Not faded, not diminishing. Gone, the skin smooth and unmarked, as though the raised line had never been there. She felt the absence of it like the ending of a sound she had stopped consciously hearing, the silence that tells you a thing had been present by the quality of its removal. She pressed her thumb against the place where it had been and felt nothing but her own pulse, clean and steady. And she thought about what it meant that an old law had waited 52 years for one person to read it carefully enough to find it. And that person had been her, not because she was exceptional, but because she was thorough, and not because she was brave, but because she had been in the right place with the right habits of attention, and had noticed when a spine felt wrong. The hall continued around her, people talking, and the council members filing out under the weight of what had just been announced, and Isolde standing at the front of the room with the quiet authority of a person who has been maintaining a hall for 31 years for exactly this outcome. Marin appeared at Sera's elbow. "Your wrists," she said quietly. "Clean," Sera said. Marin took her hand briefly and looked at the skin and nodded, and pressed her hand once and let go. Sera stood in the hall as it slowly emptied, and she thought about what came next, and what shape the next 90 days would take, and what it would mean to do her job. The real job, the whole job, the one that included not just the records but the accountability for what the records contained. Under the protection of the law she had found, there was work to be done. The archive needed to be fully reviewed. The correspondence from the period of the original concealment needed to be formally catalogued and entered into the compact's review record. The succession process needed a proper documentary framework. The PAC's records needed to reflect accurately what had happened and what had been found, and what had been decided. She was the record keeper. That was the job. She intended to do it. And if Radon Vale spent the next 90 days, said he would do, cooperating with the compact's process, and removing the people who had benefited from the concealment, and conducting himself with the honesty that the situation required. She would note that in the record, too. She would note it accurately, and without supplementing it from her interior life, and she would wait until there was enough evidence to make an assessment that was grounded in what was actually there, rather than what she had been, for 4 years, trying to believe. She would not forgive the chamber. She would not forgive the blade against her throat, or the 47 people who had watched, and the one who had stood against the far wall and said nothing. She would not forgive those things because forgiveness was not what the situation required, and she was done offering things the situation hadn't asked for. What she would do was keep her eyes open, read everything, and notice when spines felt wrong, and trust that the foundational law was exactly what it had always been, something buried by the powerful, waiting for someone thorough enough to find it. She walked out of the hall into the pale autumn light, and the forest was visible at the compound's edge in the middle distance, and the sky above the pines was the specific clear blue of a day that has no further obligations, and Sera Voss, record keeper and compact witness, put her clean wrist in her coat pocket and went back to work.